Welcome to this lesson on the Tableau Certified Data Analyst exam. We're going to be looking at using the analytics pane. There are a number of topics under this. The first is totals and subtotals. Then we'll look at reference lines, reference bands, average lines, trend lines, distribution bands, forecasting by using default settings, customizing a forecasting model, creating a predictive model. Pro tip, if I'm going too slowly or too quickly, adjust the speed of the video as needed. Now here's the documentation on reference lines, bands, and distributions. Then here's a bit on forecasting and predictive modeling, and I'll be placing links to these under the video. And so now I'm going to switch over to doing a demo on this. So let's get started with that. And now I'll do, let's say, segment and also category. Maybe like this. And I'll do sales. And so now over on the analytics pane, I can add this totals option. This totals option is not grayed out. The ones that aren't available, given the things I have in my view, are grayed out. So I'm going to drag this over, and now I can add subtotals like that. And so now under each pane, you see the total for that, the subtotal for that pane. So this is the subtotal for the consumer category, for the corporate category, and for the home office category. So that is subtotals, and now I can also do column grand totals and see the overall total, right? So this is the total for consumer, corporate, home office, and finally the overall grand total. That is totals and subtotals. If I had added a dimension on the columns area, then you would also get that option. So for example, if I do region over here, then I could add totals to, just going over here, the row as well. So now I've added the row grand totals. So that's all on subtotals and totals. The only other thing to mention is that you can change the way that you total. So right now I'm just using the automatic, which means it's going to be using the same method of aggregation that the view overall is using. Right now we're using sum for sales, but if I wanted, I could change the total all using to like an average, so that in these values 1, 2, 3, 4 are averaged to give me this value here. And now this, and this are averaged to give me this value here. So that's a different way to calculate the grand total, but I'll just hit Control Z and undo that. Next up, let's take a look at reference lines. So I'm going to remove some of these things here and switch it over to a bar chart. I'm going to make it vertical rather than horizontal. And now I have a number of new options. So I can do a reference line. I'm going to drag this into my view, and I'm going to do it at the level of the table. And so I'm going to be creating a reference line, and I can choose how I'm going to do that. So I can do the reference line based on the overall average, for example, or based on the minimum. And so now I get a line that corresponds to the minimum value for each of the three segments. And so the minimum value is related to home office, and so that's where the reference line is set up. I can hit Control Z and get rid of these lines and look at other options with reference lines. So I've got it for the table, and the label is going to say the value, it's, rather than the computation. So this currently says average, but if I switch it over to value, it's going to give me what the average actually is, and or I can just get rid of it altogether. This is how the value is calculated. So I could, for example, do my ref value like this and make it free text. 600. Then when I put the value in of 600,000, that's now my reference line. It's 600,000. So that's another option for reference lines. Now let's take a look. I'm going to get rid of this reference line, remove. Now let's take a look at reference bands. Actually, first I'm going to add a second level to this. I'm going to add maybe segment as well, or actually I have segment already. Add category here. And now I'm going to add a reference band. Maybe I'll do it at the pane level. Previously I just showed you at the table level, but I'm going to make them different for each. And so now this reference band is going to give me a low value for the minimum and a high value for the maximum. That's the max value of sum of sales. I could give you the average as the low value and the maximum as the high value, or the total. That would be much, much higher. We can define these based on these different options, right? So right now I'm using the average as one of the band values and the total as the other one. I could change it to the median and the average, right? I could set it as however I want the band from and band to options. So each of them behaves very similarly to how the reference line behaves in terms of setting this up. But then instead of having just a single line, you have a top and a bottom, and then there's a band that goes between those two. And again, we can decide, do we want this one band per pane? So that supplies. Each different consumer, corporate, and home office get their own band. Or do we want it on the whole table like this? So there's only one band for the whole table. Or do we want a separate band on each cell, which to me doesn't really make much sense. You can't really see it, but you could do something with that as well. I can do it at the level of the table, or I can do it at the level of the pane like that. Now let's take a look at trend lines. You notice trend lines is currently grayed out because I don't have the right data to show this. So I need some sort of a scatter plot, I think, here to do a trend line. Of course, if I just do sum of profit and sum of sales, I only get a single value, so that's not really interesting. But if I put, for example, subcategory here, now I do get a whole bunch of points. And I can, if I go over to the analytics pane, I can do a graph here. And so this shows that as sales increases, profit also tends to increase, and it gives me a model for how sales affects profit. So this is like an equation, and you can change the way that the equations fit. Right now, I'm just fitting a simple line. If I right click on this and say, let's see, just gonna remove that. How do I get rid of my trend line? Remove, there we go. Now I can drag it out again and fit a different equation. Instead of fitting a line, now I can fit a logarithmic equation or an exponential equation or a polynomial equation. And so you have different options for what type of a line to fit. And you can look at the R² value, and a higher R² value indicates a better fit. So this one has 0.61 versus the linear with 0.177. So it looks like the, power one was a better fit on the data than the line. That is trend line. It's basically fitting a graph to a bunch of points. So what it's trying to do is create the line that is as close as possible to all of the points. And there's a specific way that that's measured, but the point is that it's trying to make the line that best fits the data, so it explains what the relationship is between sales and profit. So that's trend lines. Now let's take a look at distribution bands, another one here. So we see that we have 60% of average and 80% of average here. And if I add an average line like that, you can see that this is the average, 16,847, the average value of all of these sum of profit points. So for example, storage has a profit of 21,279 and shares has this. And so it takes all of these individual values and averages them and finds this is the average value of profit for each subcategory. And once it has that, it's saying, okay, this is 80% of profit, this is 60% of profit. And so if I edit this band, I can change it to be something else. For example, I can do 80% and maybe 110%. So in other words, now I have a band that is both going above the average and below the average. And so if I wanted to sort of look at, okay, well, what's the sort of range of normal, right? I could set it this way. I could say, okay, I'm looking between 80 and 100% of the average. So that's creating a reference band, or rather distribution band. And we have the same thing this is on the y-axis, we have the same thing on the x-axis here. Next up, let's take a look at forecasting. So forecasting is looking at data across time and trying to predict what will happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. So I'm going to set this as a monthly view, and I'm going to go to analytics and then create a forecast. And this is creating a forecast using the default option. So this is just what Tableau will automatically give me as the future estimate. So it's saying, okay, this is what we had in November. This is what we have in December 2017. November, this is what we expect in the next month. So this light blue portion, along with this sort of confidence interval error range, is our future forecast. So it's using just the past pattern, not any of the other dimensions in the data, but just the past pattern to try and figure out what's going to happen next month and then following that. And so it'll detect seasonality. If there are certain months that tend to be higher, it should pick up those patterns. And so that's forecasting using the default settings. If I right click here and I can go to forecast and then forecast options. So now I can change the options. For example, how far into the future do I want to forecast is the first section, right? So it can say, okay, by default, we're doing 13 months, but we could do exactly 1 year or the next 3 months. So I've changed it so it's just the next 3 or 4 months like this. The other thing to note is that by default, we have this ignore last 1 month's option. And so if we want to include the final month, we could change that to a 0. And so this means that basically, before I did this, we were not including the December 2017 data. But when I made that change, I include it. And now why might you want to leave out the last month of data? It might be that the last month of data is partial. Say that the data goes up to the middle of the month because it's the middle of the month and we're trying to forecast the following month. Well, then it would look like the data was actually decreasing in the current month because we only have half the month's data, right? And so if we try and forecast based on half a month of data, we're going to assume that there's a drop, but probably in the next half of the month, most of the additional data will come in and the final value would go up, right? And so because the last month of data is often a partial, we can choose to ignore the last 1 month of data or more if you want, right? You could ignore the last 2 months or whatever. But most frequently, the current month, you're trying to forecast in the current month, in the middle of the month. And so you don't want to include that partial month in your forecast. So you can set that. Finally, under here, we have this option to use an automatic forecasting, automatic without seasonality, or custom. And so that allows us to do those different options, right? So automatic without seasonality assumes that there's not going to be ups and downs based on the season, right? Automatic with seasonality is going to pick up those seasonal variants. And then custom allows you to select additive or multiplicative on your trend or seasonality. And so just to understand that, I think it's helpful to go over to the Tableau documentation on forecasting. I'm just going to bring that up here and just show you how this documentation explains forecasting in Tableau. And so this here explains about additive versus additive or multiplicative, right? So additive models work well when the variation is sort of consistent, unlike this case where the variation increases over time and the seasonality increases with it. So in this case, a multiplicative model is more appropriate, right? So here it explains an additive model is one in which the contributions of the model components are summed, whereas a multiplicative is where at least some components are multiplied, right? And so you'll want to choose a multiplicative model if there's that increasing sort of scale variability in the data. That would be better modeled with a multiplicative model. The last thing I'm going to look at is predicting using a predictive model. And so for that, there's actually not an option, even though it puts this under the analytics pane. It's actually not under the analytics pane section. But for some reason, the data analyst curriculum includes it under the analytics pane. So in any case, what I'm going to do here is I have this function that I've written, which is trying to predict sum of sales based on the distinct number of order IDs. And so the idea is the more orders you place, probably the more you spend. And this 0.5 means that we're trying to predict the median value of sum of sales. If I did the 0.75, then that would be like the 70th percentile or 75th percentile, right? But I figure it makes the most sense to kind of look at what the median value is for sum of sales. So that's what we're trying to predict. And that's why we have this 0.5 here. And so I'm going to do sales and also order distinct orders, which I think I have somewhere, count of orders. Let's see. Yeah, so this is distinct orders. And also the customer ID. And so this shows me how many orders the customer had and how much they had in sales. And you can see that it looks like in general, as you have more orders, your total amount that you purchased goes up, not surprising. So now I'm going to add this predict to the view like this. and I'm going to set that as a dual axis. And I'm going to switch the compute using to being computing at the customer ID level so that I get a prediction for each customer ID. And now we see that the model here is giving us an increasing expected value for sales for each order, right? So for 4 orders, you're expected to order $1,900 worth of sales value. For 5, $2,330 in sales. For 12, $5,343. Right? So these blue dots are our expected values. And so this is a simple kind of predictive model that's trying to predict the sum of sales based on the number of unique orders that customer placed. So that is one example of a predictive model. If you look here under the options, anything that starts with the word model is going to be doing some sort of prediction, right? So you can look through these and see the different ways that these are trying to make predictions. For example, the percentile is giving you a value between 0 and 1. So that's a different one. So it's for example, this one, it's saying model percentile sum of sales count of orders is going to give you the quantile of the mark. So there are numerous other predictive model options, but that's, I think, probably the one that you'd be most likely to use and relatively simple.